coming. I don't know, can you all hear me okay? Because I'm just gonna have to project as best as I can. Can you guys hear me? Can anyone not hear me? I just want to start off by saying thank you so much for coming out at this late evening time. Still light out though, so and we can see if we have how far we go. I'm Julie Conroy. I'm the project manager for this Resilient Long Beach Island, and we're in the stage of our action planning exercise. So what we want to do tonight is really kind of go through a status of where the project stands, some of the recommended actions that we think are really important for you to consider, and then we'll have an activity, a breakout, where you can all really dig into the details, look at the actions list. I want to just remind everyone this is the kind of the start of the end, in the sense that we have a whole month left of creating the resilience plan for all of LBI. And we are going to come back after we've collected all of your feedback here to try and narrow down, refocus if need be, and really think about the types of actions that will work for you the best. The other thing is, we wanted to make sure that we had time to also gain your feedback on next steps, because we do have some time in this work to do some demonstration projects. So that's another thing that you'll be looking at on the table today. And so just again, really glad that you're all here, and I'll go ahead and get started. One thing I was really interested in finding out is who is a full-time resident here? Okay, great. Who owns a business here? Okay. Who is from any of the municipal boroughs or towns? Okay. And tell me if you've been to one of our workshops before, or if some of this might be brand new. Who has been to our workshops before? Oh, wow, that's great. And who has not? Oh, about half. Okay. Well, that's good to know, because what I'll do is I'll just kind of give you an overview of what we're trying to do, and really where this is going. Just bear with me a bit, because there's a lot to present, and what I'll try to do is just get through a lot of this information. We'll pause for a break. At that point, I'll tell you about the activity, and I think I'll try to make there be a little bit of time for questions and answers. So this project is, the Resilient Long Beach Island project that is through the Resilient New Jersey program. So the sort of umbrella of this work is really represented here to build off of the existing resilience planning that all of the boroughs and township has done. There's been an incredible amount of work, and we wanted to really just enhance that to have a very forward view into the future. We definitely have tried and are continuing to try to really get some participation from the community members, and it's really great turnout here, so I'm really, really happy about that. And then, of course, we really want to take that information, to take the vulnerability information, I'll explain what that is, and start to come up with real actionable projects and any associated policies and capacity building and funding type of recommendations that we have. Because it's really important that, I think the most important thing that our team is really looking to do is give you a framework, give you sort of a roadmap for how you want to implement some of these projects. So it'll be very spelled out, all of the things that need to happen and how they should happen. And when we're talking about, I'll pause here for a moment. When we're talking about resilience, we're really focusing in on coastal related flooding, because that is a major issue here. You're living it every day. And how that flooding will kind of change and alter over time, and how we feel that can be addressed. We did also do a sort of a high level analysis of other types of impacts, because obviously there's temperature increases and there's public health related issues with that. There's mobility issues that we understand that you already have, and how can we address that? So this is the whole big picture of all that work. We met with the community back in the early part of 2021. And really, the whole basis of this work is all about what is your vision for the future? What kinds of things can you tolerate in terms of how to become resilient? And so resiliency to us means that you have a long-term set of actions that will allow you to address current flooding issues, but also exacerbated flooding issues that will occur really over the next 10 to 15 years. And then we've also looked into a different time frame that's more of a longer term, sort of a mortgage-based, 30-year, if people are thinking about real estate and different options for being here, and what that means. And then also looking into the real longer term future, which is what will the island look like if it has the sea level rise conditions, flood based conditions, storm surge conditions, and precipitation. There's also a lot of issue on island when it comes to just rainfall and what happens with that rainfall. And right now, there's sort of an issue with respect to the inundation of the storm drain system, and what do we do about that? You're having non-rainy day flooding that's just coming backed up through the storm drain system, which is why Long Beach Boulevard has continuous issues at high tide. So we moved through that. We've analyzed those risks, and we've also come to the community back in October to talk about this. Is basically it's a lot to absorb, a lot of information, and a lot of things that we're going to show you tonight that are very conceptual, and we wanted to try to find a way to bucket what those actions are. So looking at things that we'll do from the water to the shoreline, also things that we want to do on island that would really be focused more on the development side. So those scenarios I'll touch upon. And right now we're right in here, April to May. We're talking to you about these recommended actions. Well, it's really important that we gain your feedback so that we can adequately, prepare a list of recommendations that are, important and meaningful. And then we hope very much that we'll still have a little bit of time to try to do some design work, some demonstration projects that will show you what these types of solutions will look like. So, and that's not the end. It might be the end of our contract, but unfortunately, we will have to kind of walk away. But the hope is that, we'll be able to look for funding sources where our team that you had seen, our full team is on the bottom here: Kleinfelder, Ramble, Robert, Deland Studio, Panoni, and Betlin. That we'll be able to come back to you with grant funding and say, okay, well, can we help you implement some of these projects? Can we work with the town engineers to implement some of these projects? So even though the end of this contract is in July, we really want to continue to move forward. So just what I would mention before is about these scenarios. There's a lot of different actions that can happen, and we try it again to sort of bucket what they are. And this concept of outside in, inside out, and on off. The on off is really the one that is sort of kind of combines a lot of the other actions, where not only are we looking at structural based actions or flood walls or whatever needs to happen in the short term, in the midterm, near term, but then what about mobility? And what about emergency access? There are just emergency access issues right now. You have one way on and one way off, and so we do want to address that as well. And then within each of those, there's these keystone actions, and that's the categories of actions that you're going to hear about tonight. Some of you have been, I think, to our scenario planning workshop, so some of this will be familiar to you about the sort of categories. But just to know that we really tried to look for a way to frame the goals and objectives that you all put together as a community about this is what we really want to see. And really the vision that we had heard back then, and we're continuing through this project, is that you understand that the ecology is really important. You're all water people, and you're surrounded by water, and you know how important those systems are, but that you love this island and want to stay here. And we're going to try to find a way that we can accomplish that for a good amount of time despite conditions. So what we've learned from the community, from you all, and we put out a survey, it was really great. We got a great response, is what we knew we would see, which is essentially we want a hybrid of the actions. We want to make sure that we preserve development, preserve community character, allow for the economy to continue to thrive, but we also, there's real importance to the nature-based solution, the ecology of this area and nature-based solutions that will protect the shoreline. So essentially, this is just showing you a graph that we've basically got, a lot of interest for nature-based and ecology-based solutions, but that is combined with, what do we do about on island? So what we're suggesting is a way that we can sort of make a hybrid version. We'll have those types of categories that we mentioned, ecology-based, sort of structural development-based, and then also the policies and regulations that you need to, the community needs to consider. It's not something that necessarily you'll address day to day, but it's important to just think in the back of your mind that with some of these policies and recommendations that we'll show you, you'll have a voice. Hopefully you'll, go back to this effort, think about what we suggested, and your voice is very important to any local regulatory changes, zoning changes, or even statewide changes. So all of this is to combine. What we're showing here is we're addressing ecology, we're addressing, development and mobility, funding, education, and capacity, and then also this concept of mobility plus emergency on-off. So we took all this information and we then created a list of potential projects within these categories that we then tried to evaluate, sort of rank in a way, because, at the end of this process, we had probably like 50 to 60 different potential locations and actions. But what we wanted to do is really narrow that down into the most important projects that would provide you with the most amount of resilience, the most amount of flood protection, but would also have multi-benefits. So thinking about things that will show you, like, it's not just necessarily changing up the shoreline or having a wetland restoration, it's can you do that and then in combination allow for a park area that's floodable, but then also recreational options, and really just bolster the shoreline in a number of ways. And so what we did was we basically came up with an evaluation that includes these types of criteria. So does this recommendation provide environmental protection or enhancement? Did the action that we reviewed, is there a real cost or capacity issue? Is it super costly? Is the community, going to have a hard time potentially funding it or getting it implemented? And then obviously, how much risk, the flood evaluation that we did, I'll show you one of the maps. It essentially, takes what is the base flood, FEMA-based elevate, the flood maps that are for existing conditions today, absolutely today, and then takes that into how does that change in 10 years? Like I said, 30 years, 50 years. So it's really important for us to know, would that action actually make a significant change? And then there's a time frame and community and socioeconomic issues. Does it have those multi-benefits that can address this? So what I wanted to do is just go through these categories. We're going to show you some sort of what we're calling exemplary locations and projects that we think would really either provide that extensive resilience benefit, provide multi-benefits, and then also really kind of help out in pushing the community forward to implement these types of projects elsewhere. So I can bring this back up because I think, don't worry about, taking notes, or because we'll be able to provide this to you, but these are the categories that you're going to see on the worksheet that you look over. And if anybody at that point in time has any questions about, oh, I forgot what you said about this type of project, we can bring it back up. But there's essentially a couple of important categories of ecology-based projects, which of course look at inland salt marsh restoration. Obviously there's a biodiversity and habitat component to it that you already want to protect these types of areas, but what happens when we have to look at, is it changing? Is there effects already with sea level rise? And then, thinking about what is the cost associated with this so that that type of project can be replicated elsewhere. So in this case, we've identified a couple of sites, and one is looking at the system down in Holgate, where there's essentially a sort of relic salt marsh system that kind of creates the basis of that shoreline, as you can see. Sorry, I'm realizing I'm now in everyone's way. On that side of the shoreline. And so we thought, there was this, obviously you're probably familiar with the washover that had occurred during the last storm, and that sand has deposited now into what was a wetland that was, functional. We're thinking about, bringing that back would really be important for flood absorption. So I'm sure you all probably are pretty aware of this, but wetlands have a great capacity to absorb floodwaters and take away a lot of the, they handle wave action. They handle a lot of increase in water level. And having wetlands such as these that are functioning is really important. It will protect adjacent development in ways that you can't necessarily replicate. There are areas that you can try to recreate and create different types of wetland systems, but it's best to really think about what you already have and how they can be restored. So that's one site. And the other is looking up at the Barnegat Light area. That whole extensive area of shoreline has all kinds of different systems. There's salt marsh, there's transitional marshes, and there's adjacent islands, and that whole system right there that you can see could be an area that could provide a lot of protection to a number of different residential areas. So these are the initial starting points for us. These seem to be the ones that really called out to us and said, these are really important sites. Let's start here. But it's only the start. You're all experts of your communities. If there's other areas, we need to hear about it tonight. And so there's also a lot of opportunity to think about this concept of living shoreline, which is essentially just trying to find a way that you can balance both, maybe there's already some, ripraps or rocky areas, maybe there's some remaining wetland, and how can you kind of work that together to provide a decent amount of flood attenuation. It holds waves back, it dissipates the wave action, just kind of shown here. And there's a lot of different ways that you can do it. And there's, clearly this concept here with the bagged oyster shells, and it then, creates a buffer for the wave action. And then you can see that salt marsh is able to then grow back, because salt marsh doesn't like, the grasses in salt marshes really they don't like there to be a lot of disturbance in their sort of sediment area. So that's an important factor for us to look at. And we did identify a couple of sites, and I know by working with the municipal leaders that there's town engineers that are also kind of looking at some of these areas as well. So for instance, a couple of areas, Ship Bottom, and again at Barnegat Light is the area where there's opportunity for both salt marsh restoration and living shorelines. We also, just important to note that we did look at property ownership, and clearly the top of the list are those that either are municipally owned or have more of a public portion of the site. So that's something that also, of course, is going to be taken into consideration as a demonstration. And then the other kind of difficult but important element is, with sea level rise and coastal storms, a lot of the sedimentation that has occurred out in the Back Bay, and there's essentially sort of drowning of the Bayside Islands. I know that the Barnegat Bay Partnership has been working very hard looking at some of these islands, as well as the New Jersey Bay Island Initiative. But what we wanted to do is there other areas that they may not have looked at, or are there other island areas that have kind of, they're sunk, but can maybe be brought back? Because these systems, these island systems with wetlands, are one of the most important resilience measures, resilience elements out there that can really provide a lot of benefit for the community. So there's just a couple statistics here to keep in mind. We took a look at these particular sites. Is one looking off of the Long Beach Township shoreline. We based on aerial photography, saw that there was a system that, there was an island that has basically been covered, but yet you could see just by looking at, the way that the water is sort of over it and near it, and the idea is that that system could potentially be brought back. There could be wetlands there, and it could be something that can absorb a lot of wave action and flood water. And then again, looking back up at Barnegat Light, that whole system, again, that's a very dynamic system. There's wetlands at the shoreline. There's other opportunities where there was wetlands at the shoreline, but there's also a similar issue with the islands that are being essentially drowned. If we brought those back, it would provide a lot of sedimentation. It would hold back waves, everything that we had mentioned before. So it's really important to think about these. That's the whole idea of out in the water, what can be done to protect the land. So a couple of the sites that we have provided on here are based on these concepts of ecosystem services and trying to sort of recreate nature and bring back that really important resiliency that it offers. And then structural actions is something that, again, we really we found that it's very important for people to be able to continue living here for as long as you can, but yet there's an understanding that there's not just, sea level rise and coastal storms, there's flooding issues that are related to precipitation and stormwater, and major issues with the storm drain system that need to be addressed. So we're thinking about a lot of different, you can start off sort of small, I'd say, with putting in these tidal valve flaps to hold, to not create inundation into the system. So hopefully that will allow the water to kind of flow through as it's supposed to. But also there just needs to be a consideration of, creating larger drainage, thinking about some other innovative concepts that we're going to present here. So there's a lot of opportunity for changing how the water flows, particularly with respect to the storm drain system. There's opportunities for taking that water out of the system and trying to convey it in different locations, understanding that there's a lot of limitations with respect to, the high water table, to infiltration capacity on a basically, sand barrier island. But there are definitely innovative ways, and we're going to give you some demonstration of that really can be employed in a lot of different areas. So it's something I think that is really important to drive home to you, that this is also something that homeowners, property owners, business owners can really get involved in. If there's we hope that I'll talk about later, that there's an opportunity to put forth some design guidelines that can be for homeowners, it can be for business owners, it can be for the municipal leaders to be able to employ these in different areas. We've already identified a few, but there's certainly more opportunities there. I know there's been a lot of talk about elevating streets, but what do you do after that happens? You have to consider that there does have to be some pretty major increase in the drainage system underneath that. It's a tricky concept, but it definitely is something that, at least our team has done in other areas of the country. But it is something that has to be considered, because there's just so much water that both comes off the back bay that also is just coming straight down from rainfall. So it has to be addressed. And so some of the sites where, again, we looked at ownership, we looked at the size of the roadway, is there a way that concept we called road diet is really just thinking about, are there opportunities for, maybe overflow parking that is not impervious, that is pervious, which is, allowing the water to go through into some system versus kind of holding itself on a paved area that, it might not be able to flow well for various reasons. So we looked at areas of ship bottom on Long Beach Boulevard. This is not all Long Beach Township. That was my era. This is really all parts of Long Beach Boulevard and different sections of the boulevard that there might be enough area to make a real change. So, and then sort of combining this together, it's also important to think about, okay, there's areas on the waterfront that are going to be flooded. They're just going to continue to be flooded, whether it's from precipitation or from the back bay, having higher water levels. And so is there a way, and can you tolerate essentially this concept of like living with water? It's, something that we've been working on from my firm in many, many parts of the globe to think about, can you have a park area that's wet, but then somehow when that dries off, there's still an opportunity for recreation. And there's all kinds of different ways to engineer that to make sure that that water does flow, and it's not infiltration based only. So there's a lot of opportunities for that. If there's open space areas and green space areas, that's something that can be accommodated. And this cloudburst concept is something that we work on a lot. And it's essentially just the fact that there's now these flash flooding events. So it's not just the frequency, but it's really the intensity. The storms are getting hard, the rainfall's getting harder and harder. There's more water that gets poured on. And with that amount of water that comes all together, it's really hard to address. It's the storm drain system's not going to be able to handle it. So there has to be some other ways. So we looked at, where are there current municipally owned parks or even just vacant lots that might be underutilized. And so we came up with a few. One is looking at Sunset Park, and the other is, vacant lot. Now, again, this is the kind of feedback that we need to get. We don't know if that's slated for development. We don't know if that's something that's owned and something will, is to be changed. We don't know if there is designs currently for Sunset Park, aside from when we've talked to, engineers from town level that have said, yes, we've looked at that shoreline. So that's the feedback we need to get. We've gotten as much feedback as we can from the engineers and the town leaders. But I think that, again, as you're, experts in your community, you live here, you know what these are all about, these areas, we would like to know if there's other opportunities. Because I think the point I want to bring home is we have the concepts, we know how to do the engineering, we know what it's going to do for flood attenuation, but we want to make sure that it's in the right areas. And so, again, we also wanted to really think about what things that you all could maybe do. It may sound a little silly with all of the flooding that we're talking about, but having the water not go onto the roadways and into the storm drain system, if there's an opportunity to reuse that in any way, even just the residential level, it would take away a lot of water. We don't necessarily have, a calculation right now for the whole island, but we've done work elsewhere, and it's hundreds of thousands of gallons of water that can be taken away. It has to be reused at a certain level. So that's an issue. There's not a lot of need for irrigation here, but there's a lot of different opportunities that water can be reused at the site level. And then we also wanted to acknowledge that, we've really talked a lot with folks who've worked here before, folks who are currently working here. This is the firm, Andrew Kogan, I always mess that up, that has done some tremendous work at the Long Beach. I think it's really the Foundation for the Arts. And that really kind of brings this concept home that you can do a lot of these things all together. So it doesn't just have to be a site that you're restoring a wetland. At this site at the Art Center, they really looked at wetland restoration, habitat enhancement, but other things that would really address, porous edges, so different things that will be employed right within the property that's developed for the Art Center. So this is sort of like a combination of like a really great location that you can do a number of these different things and what that would look like. So they have some really cool designs that they had up at the Art Center, and we wanted to acknowledge that's the kind of thing that we're trying to work with others on, and work across the aisle. Doesn't matter what firm they're with, there's a lot of challenges that we want to address, and that's a really great start. So I think, you know, obviously that's a lot of information, but we want to make sure that we could give you at least a demonstration of what this concept of blue-green infrastructure, some of the things that I just mentioned address both, you know, what do you do to convey water? How can that be reused? But also what is the vegetational needs to be able to absorb water, possibly infiltrate it? And so I'm going to have Sophia come up and show you what we've done for that.
Hi folks, yep, as Julie said, for those who don't know me, I'm Sophia. I work with Julie at Ramble as an engineer. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm going to continue to refer to blue-green infrastructure as BGI, it's a mouthful. But when we talk about blue-green infrastructure, we're referring to those solutions that Julie just ran through for you all, those that combine our blue approaches to natural water schemes, our green spaces, as a alternative to traditional approaches to gray civil infrastructure. So starting to reimagine those spaces. Julie ran through a few of these solutions, but you also might remember these images from our previous workshops. When we talk about blue-green infrastructure, we're tackling conveyance, floodwater detention, and floodwater retention, and then also beginning to think, how do we begin to reuse those water that we've captured? So with the pilot site identification for the blue-green infrastructure projects, it somewhat happened concurrently to our eco and structural-based projects. So kicking off with our site surveying a year and a half ago, we began, combined with desktop analysis using whatever geotech data we had, so soil surveys, groundwater table analysis, all of that has a significant influence on whether your blue-green infrastructure succeeds or fails. I'm sure all of you are familiar with some of the failures of when we implement rain gardens and tree pits and don't properly maintain them. So all of this is considered from the beginning, as well as our predictive flood analysis that Ramble conducted. From there, we began to consider some of the socioeconomic factors and cultural factors on island, recognizing what spaces are most important to you all, what do you use on a daily basis, and what really defines the culture here in LBI. So from there, we identified what we're calling typologies, and the types of spaces around the island that we'd like to see, or well, that you all might like to see transformed with blue-green infrastructure. So typologies might include residential areas, commercial areas, community centers like St. Francis, recreational spaces, transportation corridors, all of that. So with the blue-green infrastructure pilot projects that I'll show you, we're attempting to include each of those typologies in our transformations, and then understanding that these can all be scaled, and the solutions that we're showing you are transferable across many sites on the island. But starting with a select 4. So those select 4 are shown here on the screen to represent the tourism hub and the many tourism based economy sites around the island. We've selected Bay Village for our first pilot model. We also have a 3-block area in Surf City to represent some of the dense residential areas on island and how blue-green infrastructure can benefit some of those neighborhoods. We have a segment in Beach Haven of Long Beach Boulevard to represent some of your commercial corridors. And then finally, our beloved St. Francis Community Center, where we all sit today. So the reason why the blue-green infrastructure evaluation is kind of run in parallel to some of our other traditional assessments is because we have some other tools available to us, namely Green Scenario. This is a software that's come out of Ramble's offices in Germany and Copenhagen. It's relatively new here in the US, and so we wanted to first implement here in LBI to see what benefits could be had on the island. It's primarily a decision support tool. So I want to distinguish first, like right now, and start, not a design tool. These are not engineering plans, shovel-ready designs for the island. What we're trying to do here is enable you all as residents to be informed decision makers when we leave. Julie talked about the end, making recommendations. We're here as your consultants to make recommendations, but also to enable you all to make decisions. And so with what I'm about to show you It's an iterative evaluation of how we can apply blue-green infrastructure across the island and understand impacts on key performance indicators so that you all can assess and make decisions for the future. So where this begins is with our site modeling. So I'm going to run you through the process for St. Francis, just because we're all here today. And so from taking that Google imagery on the left, I recognize that maybe you probably can't see this, but we begin to model out our site and our existing conditions in Rhino software, for those who are familiar, and can begin to understand our conditions on the site and the current day. So what level of impervious versus pervious surfaces do we have? Where is runoff moving? What does heat and microclimate indicators look like? And begin to set benchmarks for the site. And so I'm referencing again and again a few key performance indicators. These are in water, open space and green space, microclimate, and economics. It's really valuable to pull these 4 indicators side by side to make the decisions rather than looking at one in silo, which is often what's done to date. So I think that's one of the great strengths of the tool. Today, we're going to talk mainly about water, simply because when we talk about building resilience on Long Beach Island, we're first and foremost considering floodwaters and the like. So we're looking at these 4 KPIs, and we're going to begin to apply blue-green infrastructure tools. Julie ran through a few of them there, but it might look like changing landscape materials from existing asphalt and concrete to permeable pavers. It might include the introduction of bioswales and rain gardens. Green roofs and green facades were also studied. Storage and reuse systems where we can capture runoff in cisterns. So begin to layer all of these tools. And as we start to see how they impact KPIs, we begin to build a future scenario. Not to be confused with past scenario planning efforts. I know we use the word scenario a lot, but when I say scenario here, I really just mean how can we layer up our blue-green infrastructure tools to achieve a certain outcome and to create a vision for the future. So this is our steps of data entry, solution testing, and validation. And so what this looked like for St. Francis, beginning with our existing conditions here, and then our KPIs at the bottom. So we have stormwater service level up here, including detention volumes and peak runoff coefficients. Then we have our natural water balance, which accounts for evaporation, transpiration, infiltration, and runoff. And then finally at the bottom, hard to read, with stormwater treatment. So TSS, total suspended solids in your runoff, nitrogen and other nutrient removals, and then heavy metals that also might be occurring in runoff. So the first scenario that we built out for you guys is how can we reimagine our parking lot? St. Francis has a massive parking lot. It's mostly asphalt and concrete and largely impermeable. So as we start to reimagine that parking lot, what do we see in our water KPIs? How do they respond to permeable pavers, to underground storage, to rain garden medians and increased trees? The next scenario, how can we update our community center? What if the building we're in had a small rainwater reuse program for non-potable water? And then finally, what about our open spaces? What about our recreational courts in the back? I don't remember if they're basketball or tennis, but how can we start to rethink how we're using those spaces to our benefit? And so when we talk about our parking lot reimagination, you can see the introduction of more permeable surfaces, including permeable pavers, shown here in this tan color. Increasing the number of trees. I think right now you have about 4 or 5 trees on this entire property. We can increase that number. Bioswales and rain gardens to help retain water, drain it where we want it to go rather than just letting it pool. And then underground storage cisterns. So again, when we look at this tool, we're thinking with what level of investment, with what cost can we see returns on our KPIs? The community center updates, I have it shown here from the view from the southwest. So you're now looking at the site from the water. We have the introduction of blue roofs on the community center building. Obviously not applicable over where the pool is, but for this main building over here, what if we could retain the runoff from this roof rather than letting it run off into our storm drains or try and get it out when we have high tides? What if we start to capture it and start to reuse it in our toilets or in other non-potable areas? Or what if it fed into a green facade where parts of our exterior buildings were transformed for green systems? You can't see it here because they're shown on the south side of the building for optimal sunlight, but models include green facades. And then finally, cisterns. You can see the tanks we've added in this model at the back side of the building to hold some of the water that we're now capturing. And then that last scenario I discussed was our open space transformation. So our two sites back here, we have our courts and our swimming pools outside. What if we depressed our courts and made it so that during extreme cloudburst and flooding events, they were able to detain water rather than letting it pool? We can depress our courts because most likely during your extreme rainstorms, nobody's out there using them. So why don't we use them to our benefit to store and hold water? Let's increase our green areas. I think right now this is existing asphalt. So what if we were able to transform that landscape to a green area that could not only retain more water, but also provide a more livable area for your children and for your neighbors? And then finally, where can we introduce bioswales, rain gardens, and new technology that have proven to serve runoff? And so now I'm going to compile those changes in our KPIs here from our existing conditions at the left, moving through our parking lot reimagination, our updates to the community center, and then finally our open space transformation. You can see a significant increase across our KPIs. And so those little yellow indicators mark where we're at on existing conditions, and you can see we've far surpassed them as we start to introduce blue-green infrastructure techniques. Of course, you'll also see the investment costs at the bottom goes up significantly. So now when we pass this tool on to you, it's to decide to see these returns in green space, water, and heat and microclimate. What investment are we willing to make to achieve that? And from there, we might not make the highest investment, but we might arrive at some median, somewhere in the middle. And that's for you all to decide, not for us. But we do want to arm you with this tool to make that decision. So wanted to walk you through the St. Francis model, but I will say we do have other models for those 3 other sites that I showed you, and I can pull them up briefly here so that you understand how you would navigate this tool for yourself, because the plan is that you'll be able to. It's accessible here in a web dashboard. This is the section in Surf City. So everything is super interactive. You know, if you move your mouse over one of these indicators, you'll get a description of how it was calculated. And the idea is that on your home computer, you can all navigate this and begin to understand where you might want to arrive. So for Surf City, and then also here for Bay Village. But we wanted to give you a brief tutorial today so you can kind of understand this is a lot going on. But yeah, I think that's really it on this. I just wanted to introduce the tool and show you what we hope to achieve with it, which is to enable you all to be your best informed decision makers.
Thank you. So I only have a few more slides, and then really want to hear from you all. But just wanted to introduce the understanding that there are some opportunities for building the capacity, for finding some funding sources to arrive at having these implemented easier than potentially what we have relied upon for a while now is a lot of grant funding, which is still available and actually has increased significantly. This funding came for this project, and we have had opportunities to really expand that work. But it's difficult to go after grants. So what we're thinking about first is the capacity building element. So there's work that can be done, at your level, at the property ownership level, at the residential level, but to do so, we really have to think about kind of building a bigger critical mass of stakeholders, people who can all pitch in. It's not just going to fall upon the municipality. There's also a lot of changes that frankly need to happen at the state level, more so in terms of regulatory change. That's something that our team is thinking about, considering. Our goal is essentially to set you up as a community to be successful moving forward. That's all that this is really about. We've talked about potentially a need for bringing together a regional resilience committee that can be comprised of municipal leaders, members of the community, anybody who's interested in sort of tracking the actions list that we are going to recommend in this ultimate plan and seeing how those can be implemented. So there's also, I wanted to note that there's a really cool association with respect to what they're calling adventure travel, which is, because of LBI being a destination, obviously there's a recognition that the economy has a major, tourism base, and that there's ways that you can even alter the type of tourism that occurs here that would bring in visitors to this understanding of, this is a delicate island. We are trying to become resilient. There's flooding issues. There's a lot that's happening. And how can folks be involved in that? So I just wanted to mention that that's a resource. And then funding, I mentioned before, there's this group called Ready to Fund Resilience from the American Society of Adaptation Professionals that I had I've realized now that we've had some communications with. That group is a fantastic partnership organization that community members, that municipal leaders can work with to try and come up with some innovative funding, because these projects are not, there are a lot of these projects that are more kind of heavy on the, shoreline base are expensive. And, how can there be this public-private, partnerships that could be built to help this along? Again, there are grants that are available and they're becoming more frequent, but are there other fees or other things that maybe need to occur to think about kind of keeping development at bay? But if there's redevelopment, that maybe there's a way that you can build a resilience fund to make sure that not just development happens, but it's resilient, and that you can put in place a lot of these measures. So I'm going to quickly go through these policy and regulatory actions. A lot of them, I will admit, are things that will have to happen at the municipal or state level, but we want to inform you of what those are, because again, you're the voting base. There might be opportunities for you to become involved in getting some of this change to happen. So just an overview here, there's 3 items we really want to focus on. Obviously there's a lot of history. There's, a lot of storm issues, a lot of flooding issues. There's documented changes that we've all gone through. And for a long time, there's been sort of a status quo, just being able to keep up with FEMA regulations and addressing things on a more reactive basis. And that's important, and understanding that has had to happen. But I think what we really want to emphasize is that there's now a sense of urgency. Your tidal flooding issues that you have on a daily basis, the storm drain inundation, it's just going to keep coming. And so really the whole focus of our team is to try to get you ahead of that. Try to get you to a place where you're not necessarily having to be reactive. So what are the regulations that will meet that? And then also there's so much more that can be done. And it's not necessarily actions that you'll be able to achieve immediately, but what are the things that you can think about in the future that you can become involved in? So those are those sort of 3 categories of what we wanted to go over. And so the first being, again, there is a lot of activity that has happened at the state level. We have the benefit of working very collaboratively with DEP and other agencies, CZM. They've been fantastic in kind of thinking through all these opportunities and ways that you can empower local communities. So there's a current, movement at the state level to think about these, but really what we want to do is keep you in that knowledge, so that you understand what's happening and that there's things that you probably want to become involved with. We're not going to go over all of those, but just to know that you as a community are empowered to work with the local governments and try to make these changes. It's a matter of becoming involved in the local development, any planning efforts that are to occur. Going and talking to folks at the departments of public works, the sustainability offices, anybody that anybody that you are going to be really working on these. So it's important to be involved. And so the notion again is just, there's been a lot of things that have had to happen. There's different permitting. There's municipal and county municipal land use law. These are the things that are sort of behind the scenes that are part of this mix, right? So, but there's opportunities for you to be in that knowledge base and really make things move. The urgency, I just want to emphasize again, we've looked at, there's already a major loss of tidal wetlands. Those wetlands are one of the most important components to resilience, hands down. They're the buffer between the wave action, storm, the sea level rise, and what happens on land. And so we really want to, bring this point home that there's an urgency to really look at these types of projects now. And so there's ways that we think that can really have movement and change. There's, again, the municipal land use law requirements are already out there. And so anytime that you may hear of any planning like master planning or anything that's happening at the municipal level, that's where you want to infiltrate. Because the strategies that we've discussed here and the potential for coming up with these design standards, they have to go along with that process. They have to be developed there. And those design standards or the strategies have there's a lot of different changes that can happen. And they make all of the things that we've talked about easier. So just to give you just as a large overview of the types of things that could happen, that you could become involved in, that you could support, that are happening elsewhere. There's this concept of looking at, overlay zoning, which is essentially trying to protect or regulate differently the most vulnerable parts of the island. So are there areas that we simply want to really focus heavily on, maybe they have a higher flood elevation based on our modeling that you want to consider? That might be a place that you don't just have a lower base flood elevation on an elevated house. You might have to go further. So you want to think about that, set that type of thing up so that it's easier to, have design and regulation that occurs for that. There's also a lot of new work on design standards. There's this waterfront edge certification. It's very much focused on how coastal communities can become, create a waterfront that's resilient in a lot of different ways. So Sally's telling me I am running out of time, so I'll go through these really quickly. But essentially, just so you know, that there's other methods, policies, changes, there's things that have been done across the country that are very relevant here and very replicable. There's, again, this concept of there's areas that are maybe constantly inundated, constantly flooded. They're eventually always going to have water. They can't be redeveloped. So do you conserve that area for just flood water? That's something that should be thought of. And then there's also ways that you can kind of gradually have that happen. So you don't necessarily have to pull completely back from shoreline area, but you can have zoning that then has regulations in place that say, if there's this type of impact by these types of milestones, that maybe the community, the municipality, even the state could come in and buy out that land and, create a situation where it's not all based, the property owner kind of, is able to relinquish that level of control over time, not immediately, but over time. So, and there's also a lot of opportunities. Same thing here. This is a program that was put in place in California to do exactly just that. So that if there's certain levels of damage, then there's a consideration that, okay, that's an area that maybe we just take off the books, and it's going to be a municipally based site that we could see if we can, restore the shoreline. And then, of course, you're all living with water now. So maybe there's mooring-based neighborhoods. There's ways to live on water. That's ways to address issues with respect to if you have a continually floodable area. Is there a consideration here for these types of sort of mooring-based neighborhoods that occur in different parts of the country? This is in Sausalito in California, where they've embraced this issue and have allowed development that's actually floatable. And then just one acknowledgement that, going back in time was really interesting. We found this where there's these vacation-based structures, and acknowledgement that there's a tourism-based community, but that not those properties may not, if there's something that's a resort type of item, that they're not necessarily permanent. And, maybe that's a consideration because they're going to be, areas that are going to be damaged, but yet can you have a seasonal based, economy that's based on that? So that's those are sort of the extras that I had mentioned. And then lastly, we just want to say, education is absolutely critical. And one of the things we are definitely thinking about is putting in place a long-term educational program that's part of the end result of this plan. We think that it's really important that you remain involved. Again, a lot of this work is difficult, and there's a lot of programs that are already doing this work. Reclaim the Bay for one, Barnegat Bay Partnership, and others I've mentioned. But they'll need some more help. They'll need more capacity. They'll want more community involvement because there is a lot to be done. So just to show you some possible futures, these are, again, just bringing these points home. And now it's time that we want to hear from you. So I will finally stop talking, and we want to have you take a break, get up, get yourselves moving again. But we wanted you to come back to that table. We'll give you 5 minutes, but to come back to the table that you were assigned, because we want to have you take a look. We'll have a facilitator at every table. We'll guide you through the list of projects. Obviously, we didn't show them in detail up here, but the concepts have been shown, and these are the projects the sites that we think are the best, in addition to the ones that we've given you. But we really want to hear from you. Like, are there others we didn't consider? Are there things that you know about these sites that we don't know? Are you a super big fan of a living shoreline in one particular area? And if so, tell us where. This is the time we really need to hear from you. So we'll give you a few minutes, but then if you can come back, within the next couple minutes, get back to your table, and then we'll just start that activity. We have about a half hour to do that.
I'll get this